Well, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the bulk of the American Revolution, or rather, I should say, the Revolutionary War. We're going to be focusing almost entirely on the battlefield here, and looking at this really remarkable conflict in which the most powerful nation on earth, most powerful military, most powerful navy on earth is going to be defeated by, a group of untrained and unprofessional, farm people, local farm people and local colonists. So what we're going to be looking at today are some of the turning points of the conflict, some of the major battles and ways, a little bit about the strategy so we can get a better idea of how and why this great military feat that by all intents and purposes probably shouldn't have happened and seemed incredibly unlikely, how that is able to actually take place. So we're going to begin today by looking at the two sides here, and this will give us a little bit more insight into both why this seemed like such an impossible feat and also why the colonists may eventually be successful. And I suppose at this point we can actually start calling them Americans, as we have previously discussed independence. So in our minds, although they've got to prove that, they've got to win independence, they've got to get Britain to recognize that independence, I think from this point forward, I might still say colonists, but I'll try to use the word Americans more and talk more about these as the United States as opposed to the colonies. But anyway, let's take a moment to look at the advantages and the disadvantages. Now, having just said that I'll call these the colonists, or excuse me, I'll call these Americans, we are still going to differentiate here at the moment and talk about colonial advantages and colonial disadvantages. So you get what I'm saying here, that we mean the Americans. But looking at some of the things that went well or didn't go well for the American colonists, some of the things starting with their disadvantages. So some of the things that they had stacked up against them that do not work in their favor. And many of these are quite obvious. As I've mentioned multiple times, the colonists or the Americans simply do not have the kind of training and skill. They are poorly trained. They are not professional fighters. They are, just regular folks. They are farmers. They are townspeople. They are inexperienced with fighting other than, drilling with colonial militia. And here they are, have to stand up against one of the most powerful armies on earth. So their inexperience and their lack of discipline, something that does get better, though, we should point out throughout the war. They will gain more experience and gain more discipline as time goes on, but that is definitely a factor that works against them. And they could be quite obstinate and difficult to command. And difficult to keep under some sort of a disciplined system. They also lack a lot of supplies. They lack a lot of money. Wars are expensive, and the colonies, will struggle with financing the war. That is going to be something they will struggle with greatly, is a lack of funds to pay for supplies, to pay for uniforms, to pay for shoes, to keep people fed. Those are all things that make fighting wars incredibly difficult. They are not going to have as many guns. They're not going to have as much ammunition. They will struggle with feeding their army. They don't have proper uniforms. They don't have proper tents. They don't have proper shoes sometimes. And once again, they're up against an army that's far better supplied than they are. And overall, the Continental Army is, of course, a lot smaller. It is much smaller than the British military. There are engagements where maybe they're not outnumbered, but that's actually quite rare. They're almost always going to be outnumbered. Most engagements are going to involve probably somewhere, or anywhere from a couple of hundred, but certainly less than 5,000 soldiers, which when you look at what you have on the British side, that's quite smaller. So while that doesn't always work to their disadvantage, and there are times where it actually could play to their advantage that they're smaller, meaning they can move around more, and we're more agile. Those are definitely things, and why people at the beginning of this conflict would have been looking at this idea of fighting Britain and saying, there's no way that they outnumber us, they outgun us, there's no way we can stand up to that. However, of course, there are a lot of advantages that the colonists or the Americans have. And the obvious ones are, while they may be untrained and those sorts of things, they have what we might call the home field advantage. They know the land. This is their land. These are their homes. These are their towns. And that can be an advantage for two reasons. One, obviously, is the familiarity. They know the land. They know where the roads go. They know the best places to hide. They know, they are just more acclimated to the area in which they are going to be fighting, in which the British are fighting on soil that they don't know, and they're fighting on unfamiliar ground, and the population may sometimes be unfriendly to them. It is also an advantage because are really more for psychological and emotional reasons. The stakes are just higher to them because these are their homes and their farms and their houses and their towns. that is something that kind of keeps them in it. It gives them a personal investment in the conflict that the British do not always have. The stakes are higher for them. If they lose not just the fight, but they could lose their homes, they could lose their property, they could lose their family, they could lose everything. So it's something that kind of keeps them going and can be a motivator to, encourage them to continue to fight even when things were really bad. And they're fighting for a greater ideal. It's not just about defeating the British Army on the field. There is this high idealism that's wound up in this as well, that we tend to forget, that this was about more than just defeating that soldier that was facing me. This was about independence. This was about liberty. This was about rights. This was about principles more than it was about anything else. And it turns out those principles end up mattering more to Americans than they did to their British counterparts. And that does make a very, very big difference when it comes down to it. So those advantages, though, are things that will be big morale boosters. It will be difficult to overcome those disadvantages. But the colonists were wise to those disadvantages. They knew very, very well that they didn't have the capacity to defeat the British military without foreign aid. So we are going to see them pursue foreign assistance and foreign recognition, and we'll eventually get that. And also it is the strategy of the colonists to utilize one of their great advantages, and that is the use of guerrilla tactics, the use of guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare, as some of you may know, involves less organized fighting. It is small, hit and run kind of engagements, very quick, out of nowhere, just sort of quick attack and then disappear just as fast as you appeared. Different from your formal textbook style fighting where you have, two armies in the field marching towards each other, with the goal of capturing each other's territory. That, because of the colonists' disadvantages, their lower numbers, their lower supplies, and their lower skill, people like Washington knew that was not a place they were going to have the advantage. That's not where they could have the upper hand. But their superior fighting skill in an unorganized way, that is something that they had an advantage in. If we think about Lexington and Concord, if you remember, we talked about how on the way back to Concord, the colonists were hiding along the road, behind trees, popping out of nowhere, killing off a couple of British officers or British soldiers rather, and then just disappearing as quickly as they showed up. Those are guerrilla tactics. And that's the kind of thing where they will constantly harass British soldiers. And that's not something that will destroy the British Army. You won't inflict so much damage that they can't continue to fight anymore after that. But there lies the whole plan. It's not about the strategy for the colonists is we get foreign help, and in the meantime, we're not going to be able to just defeat them outright. We're not going to be able to destroy the British Army, but we can't harass them. We can just keep it up. We can just keep on coming back for more every single time until eventually they just get worn out, until eventually they will see that the cost just isn't justified and that we're never going to give up. We are never going to stop. And eventually that does work. So that's one of the main reasons why this conflict does eventually work in the United States' favor. Let's take a look at the British advantages. And obviously some of the things that are disadvantages for the colonists are going to be big advantages for the British. The British, of course, are well trained. They are arguably the most disciplined, the best fighting force on the face of the planet, with the strongest navy on the face of the planet. They are well trained and well disciplined. They have more money. While financing the war will be a challenge for them, it is certainly going to be easier for them. They've got more money in the treasury. They have greater credit, so it's going to be a lot easier for them to get loans to pay for the conflict, whereas for the United States, that's a pretty big undertaking. They have a larger population. You're looking at overall probably about 25 million or so people in Britain, whereas there's probably about 2 million in the colonies. So they just overall have the strength in numbers for sure. And in addition to those numbers, they also have a strength in the use of Hessians. In addition to British regulars, the regular members of the British Army, they are also employing Hessians, which are basically German mercenaries. These are German soldiers that they are paying. They're mostly from the province of Hesse, which is why they're called Hessians. There are sometimes upwards of about 30,000 Hessians in the colonies to fight for the British as well. So in addition to their own individuals, they also have the help of Hessian soldiers as well. Of course, there are numerous disadvantages, though, that are going to mean the British will not be able to keep it up forever, or not want to keep it up forever, despite the fact that they do have greater military power, greater financial power, and all those things. Obviously, they're in unfamiliar territory, and we are going to talk about in just a moment some specific battles or specific moments in battles in which their unfamiliarity with the territory definitely counts against them, where they move slowly. And some of that's unfamiliarity and some of it's other things, but where they move so slow that it gives the American side nothing but time, to figure out what they need to do. And it's not just the fact that they don't know the land; it also makes them more disinvested in it. It's a distant conflict for them. It's something that they're fighting this war at a place that's thousands of miles away from their own home. So it would lead some to kind of wonder what they were really fighting for, if it was worth it. It also creates logistical problems in that you're fighting a war that's thousands of miles away from where your government is, where who's making the decisions. And they struggle to have some kind of a centralized command and a centralized decision-making structure. Oftentimes what happens is by the time a decision about strategy or whatever is made in London, by the time that information gets relayed to generals and troops in New York or Pennsylvania or wherever, it's outdated and it doesn't even matter anymore. So they really have no central nerve center to really make those commands. And so the location and the distance is a psychological problem and an emotional one, but it does cause a lot of logistical problems as well. Those guerrilla tactics that I mentioned, those are things that it doesn't really matter how well trained you are. It is hard to fight an enemy that you can't see. It's demoralizing. It may not destroy your entire unit. It may only cost you a handful of casualties, but it is psychologically devastating. And it's psychologically this is never going to end. And we can wipe out colonial troops as much as we want. But this guerrilla thing, that is this counterinsurgency, that is something that is much more difficult to defeat. And that's always going to be quite demoralizing. Also, we need to remember for the British that the war was not always popular. There were a lot of people in Britain that were either indifferent to the conflict, that kind of didn't care, or that felt they shouldn't be spending so much money on it, or even those that sympathized with the colonists. Some of those ideas about republicanism and power to the people and all this sort of stuff, the idealism that the revolution is based on, there were people in Britain who had those anti-monarchy kind of feelings too, and they may have actually thought the colonists had a point or didn't see it as something that was worth fighting over all that much. So it could be quite unpopular there. It is also something where the British, being as powerful as they were and as involved in world politics as they were, they have other distractions. This isn't the only conflict that they're involved in. They have other places where they have to commit troops, where they have to commit their resources. And so they're not able to ever put, or not willing, I should say, to put 100% everything that they've got into this conflict, because there were just other things they had to worry about. There were distractions in other parts of the world. So the fact that they are not going to be willing to give it everything they have, they're not going to, eventually the cost will just be too high. And that is ultimately how the colonists will win, is that independence is going to matter more to them, to Americans, than reconquest ever will for Britain. That doesn't mean that there aren't important battles that the colonists do win along the way. There are some well-placed, well-timed military victories that do play a role. Now, there are more defeats for the American side than there are victories, but they do kind of manage to win when they need to. So that's what we're going to look at in these next couple of points here. We're going to look at a few major battles of the war that had a particular significance. So, turning points, turning the tide in favor of the colonists. Not to be misunderstood to think that at a certain point, all of a sudden the American side wins all the time. We are just looking at things that are going to change the game in one way or the other, or keep the colonists in the conflict, or something along those lines. So before we get into this next battle, and this is going to be toward the end of 1776, let's remind ourselves of where we were militarily moving into this. So the fight at Bunker Hill happened June of 1775. At that point, the king declares the colonies in rebellion, which is essentially declaring war. At the time that independence was being debated and argued, and the Declaration of Independence being written and adopted, and all of those things in the summer of 1776, at that exact moment, the war was going terribly. The war shifted at this point, for one thing, to the middle colonies. Britain changes their strategy, realizing that going after New England, one, thus far has not worked. But to isolate New England rather than attack New England, they would move to the middle colony. So now their focus is going to be New York, Pennsylvania, that area. So we're going to see the war move to that region. There were far more loyalists in the middle colonies than there were in New England. So that's part of the reason for the change. And the idea being if we can capture those colonies, get control of them, that's going to isolate and cut off New England, and we'll go from there. So at the moment that the Declaration is being debated, New York was being invaded by a massive British force. There were thousands of soldiers invading New York. New York falls. It is captured. It remains occupied by the British for the rest of the war. They start moving toward inward into the interior, possibly targeting Philadelphia next. The Congress, which has just voted on independence, eventually evacuating Philadelphia. And it really does seem to a lot of people, really and truly, that the jig's almost up, that it is just a matter of time before Washington's forces, who have just are on the run at this point, before they are forced to surrender, before they are captured and nothing else can be done. There were even some who agreed with the idea of independence just a few weeks or a few months before this, that now see independence as unobtainable. We are just hanging on by a thread here. Britain is about to defeat us. The whole game is about to be up. And there were some that really did believe that reconciliation was the best option again. There were some that changed their minds about independence, believing that, they needed to start sort of backtracking from that so they wouldn't be guilty of treason within a few weeks. So this leads us to an important turning point psychologically in the war, not a strategic turning point, but another psychological one. And that is the Battle of Trenton, which is around Trenton, New Jersey, and it takes place December 26, 1776. So again, Washington's forces are on the run. People are questioning whether or not independence was a good idea. Desertions in the Continental Army were up. There were plenty of colonists that, because they were so locally minded at the time, they were like, look, I'm from Connecticut. I defend Connecticut. I didn't mean to go to New York. I had no intention to go and defend Pennsylvania or whatever. We didn't sign up for this. Is kind of an overall feeling among many in Washington's army. So desertions were really high. Morale is incredibly low. Washington's men are just ready to get rid of him. They are near mutinous. So Washington knows two things. He knows we've got to have a victory. We've got to do something to keep our heads in the game. We've got to do something that's going to, get us back in it, to give us back some momentum, or else we're going to have no choice but to surrender. And he also knows that momentum isn't going to come from, meeting the British in a traditional style battle, that would be suicide. So he's got to be innovative. He realizes here he's got to be innovative. He's got to do something bold. He's got to do something daring, and he's got to do something different. And that's exactly what he's going to do at the Battle of Trenton in December of 1776. So what happens in the Battle of Trenton is Washington turns his army around in the middle of a retreat. They have been on the run, away, and turns his army around and decides to go on the offensive, meaning he's going to take the war to the enemy. He's going to attack Britain. Hopefully, he's thinking they won't be expecting it. If we can find a part of the British army that is vulnerable, a smaller piece that is vulnerable, that's not expecting an attack, this will be our chance to kind of send a quick message, send a statement that, hey, we are not giving up yet. We're staying in this. And that's what he does at the Battle of Trenton. So early in the morning of December 26th, and you probably have seen this image before that you can see here, this is the famous image of Washington and his men crossing the Delaware, crossing the icy Delaware River the day after Christmas, turning around in that retreat to attack a group of Hessians, probably a couple of thousand Hessians. Think about 2,000 or so of Washington's men attacking, I think it's like 6,000 Hessians, attacking them early in the morning while they still slept, and some of them still hung over from sleeping off the effects, rather, of their Christmas Day exploits and feasting, and is able to capture or kill the entire Hessian force, losing only about 5 Americans, so only about 5 American casualties. So it is a quick and decisive victory, not a strategic one, not something that deals a significant blow to the British Army. It doesn't mean that their forces have to surrender. It is quick and simple for them. But it was very, very important nevertheless. The significance of Trenton is this is another very important moral victory. As I just described, the cause of the Continental Army, the cause of the Americans was just dangling by a thread. They were barely holding on. They were ready to surrender. They were ready to give up. And the victory at Trenton, the stunning victory at Trenton, that, hey, we just popped in and killed all of these guys or captured all of them with hardly any losses of our own, that keeps their heads in it. It's kind of like if you were to equate it to, say, a football game or something. This is that touchdown that doesn't pull you ahead. You're not winning, but you're in it. It's now something that it's not a foregone conclusion anymore that you're going to lose. It gives that momentum, gets the crowd back in the game, keeps the crowd from leaving the stadium. That is what Trenton does. It revitalizes that cause of independence. It renews that commitment to the idea of independence. Because as I said a moment ago, people were questioning that. People were saying, this isn't a good idea. We need to negotiate for reconciliation. And that, keeps people going. And Washington does have a similar victory actually about a week later at Princeton. And so I didn't mention that one, but it's another way in which the colonists he's able to do something that was daring, do something that's not going to win the war, but it is going to keep their heads in it, keep them focused, keep their attention and their eyes on the prize, as it were, keep them in it instead of surrendering. So Trenton was really important for that reason. Fast forwarding now to the following fall. Again, we're only looking at a small, teeny tiny little sampling of some battles, some that are particularly important. What's going to become a major, major turning point in the war, this time in a strategic sense, not just a quick and simple, yes, good for us moral victory, one that is going to be far more substantial in the long run. This is going to change the course of the entire war, and that is the Battle of Saratoga. You'll notice the dates up there, September to October of 1777. This is more of a campaign that lasts for several weeks, which is why you see the lengthy date up there. Saratoga is in New York. So just outside of Saratoga, New York. Now, we could get really specific and get in the weeds about the strategy and the tactics here, which I don't want to do. But just to illustrate the point, this was another one of many situations in which the British definitely had the upper hand. Not only did they have more troops and more supplies and all of those things, they had a very elaborate, pretty well thought out strategy. There were actually 3 different portions of the British Army, 3 different divisions that were all supposed to converge and sort of surround the Continental Army and destroy them. You had part that was supposed to come up from the south, some that were going to come this way and that way, all that kind of stuff. Cutting off, capturing Pennsylvania, cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies and from Canada. A plan that on paper looked beautiful, but this is where those disadvantages of the British really start to become a problem in this particular campaign. The British have this very well thought out strategy, but they are so bad at executing it. They move so slowly. There are portions of the British Army that don't go where they're supposed to go because for some reason they didn't get word they were supposed to, or they just didn't follow the instructions or disagreed with the instructions. Others are moving at a snail's pace, sometimes moving at maybe just a mile a day. The British Army travels with so much stuff because they are so big, and they are fighting in this very European style where officers carry with them, carriages and wagons full of just stuff, furniture and clothes and all these other personal effects, and all that stuff means that they move so slow, to where the colonists or the Americans rather, can keep an eye on their movements, can slow them down even further. They are cutting down trees in the middle of the road. They are burning down bridges. They're doing things to continually slow them up. And what that does is it buys the colonists time, or buys the Americans time. It buys them time to get ready, to regroup their forces, to grow their numbers, which they do. So by the time that the final engagement of this in October, when the final engagement of this whole campaign concludes, a portion of the British Army that was supposed to be joined by other portions of the British Army finds itself isolated and surrounded by Continental forces. So they didn't execute their plan. They all didn't show up together to converge, and so they end up surrounded. And so a portion of the British Army, led by General Burgoyne, has to actually surrender, not just retreat. That's different. Has to surrender his part, not the whole British Army, but his division of the British Army to the American side, to a General Horatio Gates, not Washington. He was not there. So when they surrounded, and without really anywhere to go, General Burgoyne surrenders. And so this ends up being an incredible strategic victory for the American side, because this was a formal textbook style battle. This was not a quick hit and run guerrilla kind of a thing. This was not just forcing a retreat. They forced an actual surrender, and that is different. So the significance of the Saratoga campaign, this is oftentimes looked at as the turning point of the war. There are lots of turning points here or there, but this is like the turning point, mainly because it is the American victory at Saratoga that finally convinces the French to enter the war. While all this has been going on, there have been American ambassadors, namely Benjamin Franklin, in France, in Europe, trying to get France to join in on their side. They've known that they're going to need foreign assistance. And up until now, France has been, kind of maybe, but they didn't want to actually make that commitment, because up until now, it has seemed as if this was a pretty lost cause, as if the American side was going to lose, and France didn't want to get involved in a war that they were going to lose. But with Saratoga, this convinced them that maybe it was winnable. Maybe the colonists could win. Maybe this was something that was winnable and something that was worth their time. So as a result of the Battle of Saratoga, France is going to do two big things. They're going to make an alliance with the new United States. And that is a huge, huge deal. That means two things. It means, one, recognizing the independence of the United States. So they recognize the independence, or that the United States is a legitimate independent country, thus making it more difficult for Britain to argue that they were colonies in rebellion. But most importantly, this means not only that political alliance, but a military alliance. So France, which had already been sending over a little bit of money and some stuff unofficially, now they are involved full force. So they're going to be sending money. They are going to be sending their navy. They're going to be sending weapons. They're going to be sending soldiers. Now, it takes a while for all that to get there, to get online. It takes about a year for most of that to show up. But that French assistance is going to be instrumental in the end of the war. And it is, well, I'm sure you could argue the point any way you like. It is hard to imagine the American victory being completely possible without French assistance. So now that France is in the war, that is a big good news. That's going to be morale boosting for the Americans. It's demoralizing for Britain. And it also kind of brings up another reason why Britain will eventually see this thing as not worth it, because now we were just dealing with the rebellion of a couple of rowdy colonists. Now we got France to deal with. And eventually Spain and Holland are going to get in on it too. So the whole thing blows up in their face into a big world conflict that they didn't want to sign. They didn't sign up for that. That eventually becomes part of their issue as well. So Saratoga is a big turning point because France is now in it. That's good for the colonists, not very good for Britain. So now Britain's going to try to shift their focus on the war again to a different place. That's what we'll look at the very end of it, trying to win it before that French help can actually get there, before they can actually start sending a lot of those forces and things like that. Now, unfortunately for the colonists, the victory at Saratoga is also followed by one of the low points for the Continental Army, and that is the winter that they spend in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, the winter of 1777 through the spring of 1778. Valley Forge is not a battle, but this is where Washington's army is encamped for that winter. It was typical in these days that fighting not take place during the wintertime, usually because the weather just did not permit it. So it was typical that you would go into camp for the winter, where you kind of hang out and train and sort of bide your time until the roads were passable and all that kind of thing. But this is really a low point and also a turning point for Washington's army. This is a low point because there is intense suffering at Valley Forge. This was an incredibly brutal winter with freezing temperatures, sub-freezing temperatures, thick snow, thick, deep snow. And the Continental Army, being so poorly supplied, just did not have the resources to withstand those kind of extreme conditions. So they are in makeshift huts and little structures made out of just tents and canvas and mud and logs that were not designed to withstand this kind of brutal situation. Most of them don't even have shoes. They don't have proper blankets. They don't have proper winter clothing. So people are freezing to death. They are dying of disease. The place is unsanitary. There's disease everywhere. Some of them are sick. There are thousands, that are sick and dying. And in the end, about 2,500 of Washington's soldiers die at Valley Forge, a number he most certainly couldn't afford. Hundreds more, probably about 1,000, deserted from Valley Forge, saying, I didn't sign up for this, and left because they were so demoralized and so horrified at what they were having to experience. They are nearly, just ready to turn on Washington. There was one day where 50 officers quit. Washington sends out foraging expeditions to try to find food. People are just ready to be done. I mean, it was just a tough, horrible time that almost destroys them. But in the end, it's kind of a turning point too, because after those first couple of months where it was so bad, by this March, by the time the spring starts to approach, the weather started to get a little bit better. Their health started to improve. And also, this is where we're going to start to see Washington and some European help impose a very rigorous training program. So while Valley Forge does consist of intense suffering, it is also going to result in better discipline and increased training. There are some European military officers, both French officers and even a Prussian military officer, which is what we today we'd call Austria, that are there to train and help Washington get these undisciplined kind of rabble, to get them ready, to get them disciplined and ready to take orders and ready to fight in the way that the British fight. And that is ultimately very effective. And so they actually become more united, better disciplined. And some of it's, drills and formations and shooting practice, but some of it is also, hygiene and stuff like that. Some of those European military officers teach soldiers basic things like how bathing can keep you healthier, and how not eating next to where everybody's going to the bathroom can make the disease go down. Little things like that. Well, big things, I suppose. So using those that expertise and that knowledge to really make the fighting forces a lot better. So they actually are in pretty good spirits by the time the fighting will resume. And so this actually has, in the end, a bit of a silver lining, and that the troops emerge from this better disciplined, better prepared, a true professional army that is ready to take on the likes of the British. So it does, in the end, raise their spirits. So the last part of this, in the final part of the chapter, we will look at how the war shifts after that, moving to the South this time. But before we do that, let's take a look at how the revolution affects life in the colonies, particularly how these revolutionary ideas about rights and freedom and liberty, how that affected certain groups in the colonies, because it wasn't lost on people, even in 1775, 1776, 1780, that you're fighting a war based on these principles, and you're saying over and over again that all men are created equal, and you're saying that power comes from the people, yet this is a society in which all people are not equal. And mainly I'm referring here to women and to African Americans. So that was not lost on people. So we want to talk for just a moment about how the war did affect women, African Americans, how they served, how they participated, and how those ideas did and did not affect their position. So for colonial women, and how women were affected by this conflict. As we've already mentioned, we've seen women involved in this conflict before it even was an armed conflict. We've seen women were instrumental in all those boycotts. Women helped organize and participate in a lot of those boycotts. A lot of the time, even when you think about it, boycotts or non-importation agreements, all that kind of stuff, a lot of the enforcement of that would have fallen to women first, because women were the ones that did most of the shopping and buying of things and going into the stores to purchase items. So they were the ones that were doing that. The Daughters of Liberty, making homemade versions of goods. But colonial women also, when the fighting starts, they are involved in that in some way or another. Now, for most women, that means doing a lot of what they had always done. For most women, that doesn't mean a life in the military. It means staying at home, and it means doing the things that the men in their lives would have done were they not out fighting. So they're doing the same domestic duties that they always did, child rearing and cooking and all those sorts of things. But they're also taking over the business, taking over the farm, out in the field plowing, keeping the books, doing all of that sort of stuff, and continuing to organize for ways that will support the colonial cause. So for many women, it is doing what they have always done, but with greater responsibility perhaps, and with a greater workload that they took on. Many women are also making, whether that's through the Daughters of Liberty or other organizations, there were all kinds of clubs and social groups that made uniforms, that gathered food, that made prepared food, that made bandages, that gathered bullets, that did all kinds of stuff to support the troops and support the cause. And there were those who went along with the military. There were some that traveled with the military, whether they were following or going along with a husband or a brother, serving as nurses, serving as cooks, and some that served as spies. So there were plenty of women that were involved on the military side. And while, of course, women were not allowed to enlist, and while fighting in combat was not typical and something that was very few and far between. It did happen. We don't know how many women, but we know there were a few that did dress up like men and went and fought, or those that were there on the battlefield, tending to the wounded, bringing water to people that may have just picked up a gun and gone for it when the opportunity presented itself. So women were involved in this conflict before it even was an armed conflict. We know that. And many women did hope that that was going to mean greater rights, that would mean greater inclusion. There were women who were very inspired by the ideas of equality, that were inspired by the ideas of government that represents the people, and they felt including women was a part of that. And many women did hope that this was going to mean greater rights for women, whether that was voting or at least the right to own property, at least the right to, enter into a legal contract or some other kind of legal arrangement without the consent of their husband or something like that. In few cases, though, does that actually happen. Most states will not extend a whole lot of rights to women as a result. And so women are very involved, but most of them are not going to experience greater political rights. But that does bring me to this point about something called Republican motherhood, which we'll discuss again later on, but I want to introduce it here. The revolution creates this concept called Republican motherhood. They would not have called it that at the time. The name doesn't come in until later, but we can call it Republican motherhood. And first of all, erase any notion of Republican meaning like a member of the Republican Party. That did not exist at this time. We were talking about a republic as far as a type of government, a republic, a representative government. This idea of Republican motherhood was this idea that women had a vital role to play in a Republican American society, that women should be raising up the next generation of good, responsible citizens, that they should be teaching their boys to be the next generation of voters and political leaders. Because the whole idea of a government that is based on the people, in which the people have power, that puts a lot of faith in people, and it demands a lot of people to be informed, to be literate, to be competent, to be able to make good decisions. And Republican motherhood suggested that it was a woman's job to make sure that those values were instilled in her children, that her sons would grow up to be educated, informed people that were going to be good voters, that were going to contribute to Republican society in a good way, and that her daughters were going to grow up to be good Republican mothers. So it's this argument that women did have a place that was important, that place wasn't being a voter and it wasn't being a leader in the public sphere, but that the domestic sphere carried with it an important political role. So it's really kind of strange because it argues something that we might consider more modern feminism, and in some ways it doesn't, because it is arguing, yes, that women's roles is not in public life, it is in the domestic sphere, which we would argue is not supporting women's rights. But at the same time, it kind of was, because it was also saying women have value. They are not just objects. They are not just a man's property. They are not there just to cook and clean, that they do have this higher noble purpose. So it's kind of strange in our minds, but we will continue to look at that. We'll see this concept of Republican motherhood continue on, but it kind of develops in the revolution with this emphasis on women being virtuous and supporting their country and raising, the importance of instilling these values. And to say that means that women would have to, have some kind of education too. So it does emphasize that as well. Also, of course, African Americans, which of course the majority were enslaved. Once again, it was not lost on people, African American or not, that you're fighting a war claiming that all men are created equal, claiming freedom, while denying that freedom and holding people in bondage. That was not lost on people. So this was an awkward situation that people did notice and people did call out, particularly amongst free African Americans in the North, that argued this has got to be a fight for something greater, and that African Americans should be included in this, and that slavery is incompatible with this. African Americans actually fight on both sides in the war. African Americans will fight in the Continental Army, maybe somewhere around 5,000 African Americans fight in the Continental Army, and others will fight on the side of the Loyalists. That could be because they had owners that were Loyalists, could also be choices that they made individually. And the same is true for African Americans who fought for the Patriot side. Some of those African Americans were free. Probably the majority of them were free prior to the war. They were free African Americans from the North. But there are plenty of cases of slaves that were either allowed to enlist by their owner or that escaped, ran away. So there's a little bit of both. Now, African Americans do fight on both sides. That was something that Washington was kind of conflicted about. Keep in mind, Washington was a slave owner. In fact, one of his slaves fought on the Loyalist side, which is really interesting. But he was conflicted about this, but the British eventually offered freedom. There was something issued called Lord Dunmore's Proclamation, which offered freedom to African Americans who fought on the Loyalist side. So you can imagine that many of them took them up on that offer and went to fight for the British side. At that point, Washington accepts African American service in the Continental Army. And it is very unusual. The Continental Army is rather unusual in that it is integrated. Now, some units were segregated. There were some units that were strictly African American units and some that were strictly white units. There are some that were integrated, though. Overall, African American service is something that we will not see again at all until the Civil War. And then seeing integrated units where you have white soldiers and black soldiers fighting right next to each other, that will not happen again to the 20th century. So it's really quite an unusual army that we do see African Americans fighting on both sides. Now, as I was mentioning, many African Americans, of course, hoping that the ideas of freedom and liberty and equality would eventually translate into attacks on slavery. As we know, unfortunately, it really doesn't. We're going to hit that again in the last section. Yes, there will be some states that will start abolishing slavery, but we know that it's not going anywhere in the South for quite a long time. So unfortunately, for many women and of course for African Americans, particularly those that were enslaved, fighting for those ideas did not necessarily mean gaining them in an explicit way themselves. So those things become quite complicated and becomes kind of a complicated legacy of this conflict, and we'll continue to see those problems wrestled with over quite some time. So the tide has shifted in favor of the Americans, maybe. We're going to see what happens there in the final years of the war as the British once again shift the conflict to another region to try to end it quickly before the Patriot cause gets a little bit too out of hand. So that's what we'll be looking at next time.